Welcome to our program, Dynamic. With me today, we have a special guest, Pastor and a Doctor, Ron de Prier. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Oh, it's a privilege to have you here on the set. Now, today we're going to delve into a topic we were busy with, writing a doctoral thesis. Can you maybe just share with us quickly where you were today and why you are here before we delve into more history about Ron de Prier himself?
All right. Well, this very day, I was at the University of the Western Cape,
Yes.
Belleville,
Yes.
where here's the graduation ceremony program, and was honored, blessed to receive a PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, in Theological Studies.
Wow.
With the emphasis was in the New Testament, but it covered the entire Bible. So it's a PhD in Theological Studies.
Now, we just want to get an overview about Ron de Prier. You know, when you look at your Facebook, you always see, where's Ron de Prier now? But I want to ask the question, who is Ron de Prier?
Yes, I was born in Wynberg, Cape Town.
Oh, really?
Yes, many moons ago, as they say. My father and mother, both from South Africa. And so that's where I was raised, essentially in the Cape area. Although my dad was pastoring for some of the time, and I was in Oudtshoorn with him, and we traveled a little bit. But Cape Town is my home, so I'm really back home. And I studied at UWC because I found a very good professor who agreed that the Bible has objective truth in it.
Wow.
And I was glad to hear that. So dig into it and see what we can find.
That's amazing. So when did you do your theological studies?
Well, I started originally, if you want to go back.
Yes.
I graduated from Helderberg College in 1974.
Why theology?
Again, probably because I've always wanted to do something of service to people. Originally, I was going to go to pre-med studies and then to become a medical doctor. But instead of working with physical hearts, the Lord moved me to working on spiritual hearts. So that's what happened. Yes.
Wow.
So, but I started in 71, the theology, and then finished in 74.
Now, most people go into pastoral ministry when they've studied at Helderberg. But you also went further eventually and also did your doctorate here in South Africa?
Correct. Now, of course, that's you're right. Most people go straight in. I wanted to go on. I often jokingly say I wanted to get my MA before my MRS, my missus, my wife. So I worked for a couple of years in Johannesburg to earn enough money to go to the United States to work on my master's. And so finished that in 1978. First master's, Master of Arts in Religion, got that done. And when I was done, I went to South Korea as a student missionary. And there was a young lady there from Texas who also went as a student missionary. She arrived a few weeks after I did. We became acquainted. We both loved serving the Lord. We found we had many common interests, common goals. And of course, we've been married now close to 40 years.
Wow.
So God is blessed. But that's my first master's at Andrews. And then I went back to Andrews University, finished Master of Divinity. So the first master's was really with a major focus in counseling. So I wanted to be working with young people. And amazingly, God has opened the doors that virtually just about every year, I'm working with young adults, either in speaking or hiking, or every year I've been involved. But then I went back, did the MDiv, Master of Divinity, for pastoring. And then I went and did the Master of Education for teaching. So, counselor, teacher, pastor was those my first three.
And thereafter you did your doctorate?
Correct.
And it's in ethics?
Well, my first doctorate was a Doctor of Ministry in Missions.
Oh, really?
Yes. So that was a doctor of, I studied the very controversial discussion topic of polygamy.
Oh, really?
Yes, I did a Doctor of Ministry looking at polygamy in the Bible. A very interesting study, eye-opening. And in fact, just a few months ago, I was in Kenya speaking for a family life conference for all of Africa. Leaders from all over Africa were there. And one of my topics was polygamy. Even though I graduated 25 years ago with that degree, I still have the opportunity to speak on my first doctoral study. After that, I went to the University of South Africa and did a DTH, Doctor of Theology, or in the United States, they say THD, in theological ethics. And followed up with what I've just completed now, which is a PhD in theological studies with an emphasis in New Testament because the topic is Colossians chapter 2, verse 16.
Now, I have a question. This is just something to throw in because many of our viewers will wonder why in the world will somebody need such a lot of education? What's the need? How would you answer something like this?
Well, I said that when I was in Korea after my first master's degree.
Yes.
I met a young lady from Texas.
Yes.
And we became better and better acquainted. And we found out that part of our interests were to serve the Lord as Christians as fully as possible. Now, we know Paul talks about, if you can serve the Lord and remain single,
Yes.
good. If you cannot get married, and then most people have children. My wife and I said, let's follow Paul's advice halfway.
Okay.
So get married, but have no kids, so that we can spend more time in studying and digging. And we felt called to dig deeply into the scripture, study, and then make a contribution that way, to be a blessing. So it was never my intention. In fact, when I went to from South Africa to the United States in 1976, that's when I left here, December 1976, my goal was to not get a doctorate. In fact, I said, I don't want any doctoral degree, because I'd noticed that sometimes when people get doctorates, it separates them. They're in this different in the cloud, in the upper echelon, and they don't seem to connect with what we often call the everyday person. And I said, I never want a doctorate because I don't like this separation. And so the irony is I end up now with 3 doctorates, but the Lord has blessed.
Our plans, not God's plans.
That's right. And the Lord is really blessed. And I have remained friends. And in fact, few people call me doctor. That's the funny thing. They call me Ron, my first name, or they call me Pastor Ron, or in South Africa, Pastor Ron.
And you're not worried about it?
No, these are my friends. We're all on the same journey. I just we felt we were called to spend our time in the Lord's work. And so today people came in and said, you've got 3 doctoral degrees. And as I was talking with a couple there, I said, you know what? It's harder to raise 3 children. And the wife started smiling. I said, you see, you can't just put your kids on the shelf, they keep coming back home. And she laughed. She said, that's true. That's true. I said, so I did it the easy way. Then I added, and I'm from Africa. Africans love big families. So I've got 3 masters, those are the boys, and 3 doctors, as we say in Afrikaans, dochtergrade. So these are my daughters, you see.
That's nice.
So I said, I love a big family. I've got 6 kids. I'm a real African man in that sense. So anyway, that's the background. You understand. So I tell people it's nothing great I've done. It's just that we chose to get involved in serving God and trying to find answers, trying to be of service. And so I've taken difficult subjects like polygamy, my first one. That's a huge challenge in much of Africa.
So
complex. And, how do we deal with it as mission workers? So I got into that. The second one is how to make good decisions. I was worried about young people making bad decisions. So I did a doctoral study on that issue.
Wow.
So anyway.
That's amazing. It's just the other day I answered somebody also that question and told them, if you look back, all the main reformers, they were learned. They were studied. And it can help somebody to be more efficient in the Lord's work.
Right.
Of course, depending on the attitude.
Yes.
But yeah, that's quite amazing. But just bringing it back, I have some of your books on my bookshelf. I brought them along here. Just want to ask you some questions on this.
Okay.
Before we get to the nitty-gritties.
Right.
I have a book here called Pathology of Polygamy.
That's right.
Was this before or after your doctorate?
It's actually excerpt from my doctorate.
Oh, really?
Some of the chapters in there, and including a chapter from my advisor for my doctoral study, Dr. Richard Davidson was advisor, and he gave me one of his chapters, which says it. I mean, he's very learned, worked as a professor for decades, and he contributed a chapter that is kind of even clearer than. And he had a PhD.
Yes.
But I was doing a doctorate of ministry, so I used his chapter, which echoes mine and goes even deeper. So that was a selection of some chapters from my doctorate study, including additional materials. Yes.
Okay, then I have a second book here called No Fear for the Future.
Right.
Affirming Divinely Directed Origins with Ethical Principles for the End Time People. Now, there's quite a few topics in this book.
Correct. Yes.
It's not just one topic alone.
No. Correct.
I really appreciate this book. It was
Right.
it was quite, and it's especially written for more lay people.
Yes,
Um,
yes. And that actually comes out of a series of meetings I did.
Uh-huh.
So it was more talking to the everyday person. So that's why you can see it was, you said, for lay people.
Yes.
It wasn't written as a scholarly book
Yes,
such.
yes.
It was really presentations I made.
Then here's a book that really helped me in my ministry.
Good.
On ethics.
Right.
You are faced in so many different situations with so many questions. Morals for mortals.
Right.
Biblical road signs for difficult dilemmas. Now, was this before or after the doctorate?
Oh, that's a good one. It was during the process.
Okay.
Because I started getting into ethics way back in 1970s, mid-70s.
Yes.
And I took a course on ethics and was troubled by some of the statements that the professor was saying. And again, is he right? Is he wrong? And the textbook he was using got me interested. And the textbook he was using was by a scholar, a Christian scholar in the United States. And I eventually wrote my thesis on his ethical system.
Wow.
Because that was the first ethics textbook. And I went to the place where he worked. He was very gracious, very generous, gave me photocopied all the material I wanted free of charge. And I was studying his ethical system. His system is called, nowadays, it's the greater of two goods, or ethical hierarchicalism, not the lesser of two evils, but the greater of two goods. And so I was delving into that. And during the process of time, I wrote different articles, got published. This is a compilation of articles published over about 10 or 15 years. 15 years, and I put them together. The first few chapters are principles, and then I go to application, practical issues, lying to save life, abortion,
exactly.
And that's it. So I lay the foundation, and then I go further.
It's like for our viewers, for instance, if you are confronted with a question in a desperate situation, will I lie to save my life or those of somebody else?
Correct.
For instance, like in World War II, with Corrie ten Boom, and in all those type of situations. So this is an amazing book.
It's written as a scholarly book, but if you go to the footnotes, there are stories in the footnotes, by the way. Okay. Somebody who was looking at said, man, I was glad you have in the footnotes, you have stories that illustrate the principles, but it's written as a scholarly one, and it's been used as a textbook for the high school level. And it was used as a textbook, at least for 3 semesters, for the undergraduate level. And it was used as a textbook for doctoral students.
That's amazing.
So I was amazed. And it was never written as a textbook. It's a compilation of essays.
But it's quite important because I realized when I looked at other spiritual leaders that many of them, it's more gray than black and white.
Right.
And sometimes, they use some of these ethics to actually tell you to break God's commandments.
That's unfortunately where some have gone, even professors and scholars. You're right.
Just to put it in plain language.
Yes, correct. And that was what I was looking. I wanted to see is are the commandments or just suggestions?
Yes.
Okay. And the evidence from Scripture is these are commandments, but the issue comes down to, do I trust God? That's the real issue. When I'm faced with any situations, trust Him, and therefore I will be faithful. And so you have in the Bible many stories of martyrs who were stoned for their faithfulness. For example, or beheaded, John the Baptist, or thrown to the lions, then Daniel, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire. And they all didn't survive. I mentioned John the Baptist. People are faithful. And it's the idea of Revelation 2 verse 10, the concept there, be faithful unto death.
Yes.
That's the calling. If people were not, there'd be no martyrs. And there's a whole history of Christians throughout history who remained faithful because they trusted God.
If you will follow your logic, you will always have a reason to not follow God's commandments, in that desperate situation.
Correct. Yeah, and it's a call for faithful, trusting lifestyle with Jesus. That's the idea. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm dealing with what should we do and what does the Bible teach us? And should we follow the fallen, fallible, failing characters of the Bible? Because people say, but Abraham lied, or Rahab lied. And then I often say, and who is our example? They stop, Jesus. Yeah. And the Bible says, and Jesus never lied. Excellent. He was always faithful to his Father. So that's the point. I want people to know they must look to Jesus. Don't look, because if you look at the Bible, for an excuse, you can find multiple excuses for all kinds of things.
The other day, I picked up this book and I was fascinated. So I
Okay.
bought myself a copy, Feast Keeping and the Faithful.
Yes.
Should Christians observe the annual feast days? Now, there's a bit of a correlation with Colossians 2, verse 16, where we'll come just now.
Yes.
But why did you write a book like this?
Wow, this is interesting. Because of my study on Colossians
Yes.
2:16, which I will be mentioning when I started
Yes,
and
yes,
how long, people thought that I was an expert on the feast days, I think, because in Colossians it talks about feasts, new moons, and Sabbaths, okay? And so I was invited to go to a church where the pastor invited me because he was having some concern because there were members of his church and the overall denomination to which he belonged do not keep the feasts, but there were members of his church that began to keep the feasts. And so he called me in to come and address the matter. And I went there and he wanted me to speak. But I said, I want to meet the people first, because for me, I don't want to get up and just speak against individuals. I want to know them. And when I know people, by God's grace, I can then be more gentle because they're my friends. So if I disagree...
And understand the context.
Correct.
And the underlying principles.
That's right. And know where they're coming from.
And their questions.
Right. But I'll tell you, when I met with them that Friday night, I remember to this day, they asked questions I had no idea of. I was shocked. Here I had 3 master's degrees, 2 doctorates, and I didn't know how to answer the questions they asked. So I had to stop and say, oops. I went to talk with the pastor. The next day I said, I can't do what I was planning to do. And these feast keepers then invited me back. I went back twice to sit with them, to visit with them, to listen, to get DVDs and books and everything. And I went to 2 of their feast keeping camp meetings, one around Passover and Unleavened Bread, one around time of Tabernacles. Because I found out how ignorant I was. You see, here's the word ignorant, and I had 5 graduate degrees, and I'm ignorant, or postgraduate. It's like, so I had to learn a lot, and then I had to spend a lot of time looking at the questions and the issues they raised. Because when I went through my schooling, it was never an issue, never came up as far as I remembered. That's how this came about. And I had one of the leaders of a conference, a section, I think it was 2 states, and he said, can you bring me, I need material on this. I said, well, I can get a book ready on it. And he said, I said to him, when? He said, in 10 weeks' time. I said, I'll do my best. And we put that together in 10 weeks.
What?
Yes.
It's a decent book.
Yes. And that's one of the earlier editions. There's a newer edition.
Oh, really?
It's revised, expanded.
So
it's a little
I'm sitting
old.
with an old copy.
Yeah, the content hasn't changed. But when this came out, my feast-keeping friends looked at it and raised some challenges and some concerns and thought that I used the word ignorant once. And they said I called them ignorant. I didn't. I was intending to say they are ignorant of this fact. So I changed the word and said unaware. And so that, because I'm not trying to belittle anybody or trying to make myself more clever. I said unaware of the fact. So I changed from ignorant of the fact to unaware. So I tried to make the wording more open and inviting. So I made a few, and then I also answered some of the questions and bigger challenges they raised. They showed me that I wasn't, they said, what does he mean by this? And I went in and clarified things. And so we've got a newer edition that's come out called Revised and Expanded. Yeah, so it's been a fascinating journey, learning, and from my journey with the feast-keeping people, some actually thought I had joined them because I went to these meetings, and I didn't go undercover. I went because they'd invited me, but others didn't know I was invited. So people thought, oh, he was a feast keeper, now he's abandoned us. I was never a feast keeper. I was just trying to understand. And I told the feast keepers, I said to them, if this is a biblically legitimate thing, I will join you. I told them that. And I said, I hope that you're willing to join me and give up the feast if I can show that it's not. And so I went to the totally open-minded. And they were thankful, as in our discussions. They said, Ron, you're the first theologian, church leader who has come and spent time with us. Thank you. And I wanted to do that as thoroughly and carefully as possible. So that was, but it came out of Feast, New Moon, Sabbaths. My focus was the last term, which we're going to get to, but that's how this opened up, and I ended up with, that actually has become my most quote-unquote popular book. It sold probably more than almost anything besides this little book that will come to right now.
Yes, this is one of the first books I got from you, Putting the Sabbath to Rest, a scriptural study of Colossians 2, verse 16, by
Right.
Rhonda Prier. Now, it says here at the back, it's interesting. Regarding Colossians 2:16, the renowned Walter Martin concluded, in the light of this scripture alone, I contend that the argument for Sabbath observance collapses.
Yes.
And that's quite true. In many minds of many pastors out there, especially of Sunday keeping churches, this is a powerful text to use against Sabbath keeping.
Correct. Correct.
While and then it goes on to explain it. So, what led you to this study of Colossians 2 verse 16?
Yes, and that's a long, long journey.
Yeah, that's a long journey,
Okay.
because now I have another book in my hand, Judging the Sabbath.
Yes.
Discovering what can't be found in Colossians 2 verse 16. Put a bit differently,
Yes.
in another setting, from another angle,
Correct.
but on the same topic with more information.
Yes.
So, you take the same quote of Walter Martin.
Yes.
In the light of the scripture alone, I contend that the argument for Sabbath observance collapses. And then, not so fast, says Rhonda Prier. I like that.
That's right.
So what on earth? How do you get to this study?
Okay, so let me hold these
Yes,
back to
yes,
illustrate
yes,
these in a
please.
minute. But back in 1989, 30 years ago, January 1989,
Wow.
I was doing doctoral work in the United States, in Michigan. And I was in a doctoral class by a well-known professor. He's a Dutch professor, studied at the Free University of Amsterdam.
Oh,
His name was
Hans
Hans
Larendel.
Larendel. And so I was taking this class with him, and he said, doctoral classes, you choose what topic you'd like to write on. And for some reason, my attention came to Colossians 2:16. And I think perhaps why there has been, in the past, and even up to the present, some debate, even amongst us scholars of the same church, some discussion and debate on the text. And I said, let me take that as my topic. And I'll be honest, officially, we kind of generally hold one view. When I read the scholars, well-known scholars who wrote on the topic, one with his doctoral study, one with a master's study, they both claimed that it was seventh-day Sabbath in the text. And they gave their reasons for it. And here's my confession. I said, wow, they've got strong arguments. That looks right. And so, and I'm busy working on my paper. It took me weeks, I don't know, maybe months. The course was probably about 2.5, 3 months long. But because it looked like they had some arguments I had never even heard of, never even considered. And boy, it was pretty persuasive. And it's the general arguments that we're going to talk about later on. The triad,
yes,
this feast, new moon, Sabbath, the triad, annual, monthly, weekly. That's the argument that they were using. And I'd never been aware of that for some reason. I may have come across it, but it wasn't a focus. I'd already been doing so many other studies. I have many irons in the fire, many interests, So long story short, I said, okay, let's jump into it. And I struggled and I wrestled and I started going now. Besides those scholars, I decided to go back to the actual text. What does the text of Scripture say? And not only in the English language, but go back to the Hebrew and the Greek. Because, the English Bibles and Afrikaans Bibles and every Bible really comes from the Hebrew and the Greek manuscripts. Absolutely. And in the Hebrew, there's virtually no discussion to debate which manuscripts. Generally, almost everybody agrees it's the Masoretic text. Yes. But I wanted to do a complete study of the Old and New Testaments because, as most people are aware, the New Testament builds on the Old, and in the Old you get the Hebrew Shabbat there, and there are 111 instances where the word appears, and what does that word mean? So that's where I got into this in a fascinating study, and then I found out that those two scholars with a master's, one guy and the other with a doctorate, both who had been professors, wait a minute, they hadn't gone deep enough. They had gone deep and caused me to shake on my view, and I switched to their view, but I went down to rock bottom. And I found out that their arguments were not as serious when you go back and you check the Hebrew and the Greek. If you simply go with, unfortunately, sometimes mistranslated English versions, I mean, there's no perfect translation. We know that. That's why we often go and check translation against translation if we don't know the original. That's right. If we don't know the Hebrew or the Greek, you see, we check various translations, but I said, wait a minute, their arguments were not as solid as I thought. And I started digging and digging. By the end of the course, I had a 100-page paper. What? Yes, 100 pages. That was 1989. Fast forward about a decade or so, maybe 15 years, I bumped into a young adult. Again, I almost every year I'm at young adult meetings speaking, presenting,
Mhm.
and so forth, whether it be a youth congress or camp meeting or whatever. And a young adult came to me and said, I understand you've done some study on Colossians 2:16. Well, she was a Sabbatarian, keeping the seventh-day Sabbath.
Yes.
And later on, I found out, I didn't know why she came and asked me the question, but she was dating a guy who kept Sunday.
Oh.
See? And he had been challenging her with this verse. And I didn't
Problem.
know. That's right. This is the challenging verse. And so she came to me and I promised, I said, look, I'll take my paper and I'll make it in a format that you can read. Hence this. And so
Oh.
we did. So I put the 100-page paper for the everyday person, and you see I just have check marks
Yes,
where the
yes,
Hebrew
yes,
words are.
yes.
I have no Hebrew and Greek there. Check marks, okay, not translated.
We'll show that on the screen for the viewer.
Yes, but that's it. This is the simplified version. We got to the printer and he said, you have no cover. You only have contents. And at the printer, he said, my wife just made a cover quickly. So we call it the ugly book because we had no cover made at the printer. She quickly typed this up and said, what color do you want? Green. So this is the ugly duckling, as a something idiom. That's why this looks like a non-book, because we had no cover. We were just going to put together. And it became pretty popular. I think 1,000 copies just were, because different conference leaders, they said, can you send me 100? Can you send me 200? So I can share this, because this is how. And from this, the spouse of a pastor in my conference at that time, I was working in Michigan, took it home. And so this guy reads this thing, and he reads it on Friday night, he reads it on Saturday, and Sunday he calls me up. He says, man, I read this book of yours. This is awesome thing. Would you meet with me for lunch? Yeah, glad to. So Monday we met and sat me down, and he said, listen, would you rewrite this little ugly green book to share with non-Seventh-day Sabbatarians?
Yes.
And, rewrite it, because I just did this for that young lady and ended up for a lot of pastors, Sabbatarian pastors. And now he said, so that we can share with them the reasons. And so out of that grew this book, which is twice as large as this book. And this is Judging the Sabbath.
The layout is professional.
Yes, it is, because it was done by, this is my academic publication. When you publish with an academic press, and they asked me for it, which is a little more, I was encouraged, rather than me, please, would you publish for me? They came and said, would you write a manuscript? And so we put it in two parts. The first half, called part one, about halfway, is what we call for the educated layperson. Even if you got to high school, you're educated, you can read and understand. The second, part two, is for the deep scholar. So we split this study into two parts. This simple one, we made it deeper and split it into the two parts. But it's not, I have a train driver who's now retired in one of my congregations. And he read this. He's like, wow, he's so excited, because he's a careful thinker. He worked, I don't think a driver, but he worked on the trains for most of his life. But he's intelligent. He's not perhaps formally educated, but he loved this as he read it, and he understood it.
So that's for the average Christian, even those who keep Sunday, to basically understand what the text Colossians 2:6 means.
Yes,
16.
Correct. This is what it was. And so, and during the course of time, I know of when this first little green book came out, a friend of mine came to me and said, would you sell me an extra copy? I said, why? He said, I'm having great Bible studies with a friend who's a Sunday keeper, and I would like to share this with him. I said, I won't sell it. I'll give it to you. What's his name? I signed it, gave him a free copy. It's a simple thing. It cost maybe $5 or even $3 to publish. And he took it to this young man he was studying with. Both of them were young. And he actually accepted the Seventh-day Sabbath, became a Seventh-day Sabbatarian by reading this little ugly green book. The cover didn't matter. He was interested in the contents.
Amazing.
So, as you look at it, it's only really 50 content-wise, maybe 50 pages if you don't look at all the footnotes.
Yes.
So that's this little one. And then from this one, I actually bumped into a man myself later on who came to me and said, hey, thank you for this book. He was probably twice as old as a young man, and he was also had graduated. He was a Sunday keeping pastor, and he said, thank you for this book. This is the book that got me to see the beauties of the Seventh-day Sabbath and I became a Seventh-day Sabbath keeper as a result. So I've seen two myself that I know of from the study, and I'm not boasting. I'm just saying,
Yes.
thank you, Lord, for me being able to share, because the Sabbath is not a legalistic thing.
No.
It's to spend 24 hours with your best friend, Jesus.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And of course, if you're in love with somebody, you want to spend time with them. You love spending time, quality time, and of course, sharing with others. So that's what it is. And that's how these two earlier books were already instrumental in helping people see, what is this verse actually talking about?
So, Dr. DePriya, we're gonna spend now the next part of this program in just getting into this verse, why it is important, and just an overview. And then the next program for our viewers, we will really delve into this text and look at all the objections.
Correct.
Why people use this text to basically object to the keeping of the 7-day Sabbath on Saturday.
Okay. But before we do that, as I said at the beginning of our chat, and now as we're going into the thesis that I've just finished, I really want to firstly say I'm grateful to God for sustaining me through this journey. Because people say you've gotten another doctorate, and this is my third, and people jokingly today, even my advisor said to me, "Are you going on for a fourth?" I said, no. My wife says this is the last, and I'm inclined to agree. But the thing is, how did it come about? So firstly, I'm grateful to God for sustaining me through this, because it was a long journey. I actually got into this study. I got accepted at the University of the Western Cape in 2007.
What?
Yes. Now, I actually contacted my professor in 2002. I found an email. I started communicating with him in 2002. I had just come back from mission service. My wife and I had served in Zimbabwe for 4 years. Then we'd served in Peru for a short while. And we got back to the United States. And I was now pastoring. And in 2002 to 2007, those 5 years. But I came out of academia back into, and I'd been mainly in academia before. Now I'm thrown into pastoring. It's a brand new ball game. Because I've been in academia a long time. So I spent I'm getting my earlier study into practice now. But so those 5 years between 2002 and 2007, when I first contacted really Professor Douglas Laurie is his name. He's now retired, still works a little part-time, but he had agreed about this topic. And it took me 5 years to get my proposal in and accepted. Now, thing is, I've been doing everything else. I was publishing multiple books, including most of the ones that we were showing here. I was preaching, traveling. 1 year, I traveled 5.5 out of 12 months. I wasn't home. I traveled extensively, spoke many places, and as a pastor, so I was thankful because I have the training, but I also had interns. I lived close to Andrews University, and the interns would help keep the church moving. So I traveled a lot. But so 2007, got my proposal in, got it accepted. And then when the proposal was accepted, it was the same within a few weeks or months when the president of the Andrews University Press contacted me and said, would you get us a manuscript? I said to my wife, this is weird. I get published, or request for publication. I get accepted for my proposal. And then a broadcasting company called 3ABN contacted me all within about 2 or 3 months. Would you come and make a presentation on the same topic?
What?
And I said, wait a minute, looks like God is hitting me on the head saying, it's time to get this study properly done. I'd done a 100-page paper. I got this ugly little book done. I'm working on this book. So I went to my conference president and I handed in a resignation. I said, yeah, literally. I said, I am resigning from the ministry or taking a leave of absence. For how long? I said, depends on what the Lord wants. So we have no kids, no grandkids, so we have flexibility. We took a leave of absence to go firstly get this book done and to go and work on Colossians 2 verse 16, the doctoral study. So moved out to California where I was going to do some part-time teaching, and my wife was working full-time so I can get this done. Within 6 to 9 months of us moving out there, Linda came down with cancer.
What?
Wow, that hit us like a bombshell. And I remember Linda turning to me and saying, Ron, the devil, I don't think wants you to get this book done. Go ahead, get the book done, And then we agreed I would put my
Mm.
doctoral studies on hold
Mm.
so that I can focus on making sure she gets
Yes,
healthy.
yes.
So I got the book done in 2008. That's why publication date 2008. And then Linda, in a sense, became more of my focus.
Mm.
Had to change some of my plans. You had to go
Mm.
through treatment and all that.
Sure.
Just really adjusting life accordingly. And after 6 years, when she eventually, thank the Lord, went through surgery, radiation, didn't have to do chemotherapy, thankfully.
Mm.
Once she was in remission, after 6 years, I then got back into the PhD program, and the university was gracious enough to accept me back.
Wow.
So it didn't take me that long, except that I withdrew for about 6 years.
Mm.
Again, I've traveled quite a bit to multiple countries and continents, speaking and making presentations, etc. And putting out theological fires. I was also the member of the Biblical Research Institute
Yes.
for about 6 years.
Mm.
So I've been involved in scholarship and academia. And so this study just couldn't get done.
Yes.
So why did it take so long? I jokingly say I'm a slow learner, but it's because I've been involved in ministry. But then my professor contacted me. I was in South Africa about 2 years ago, and I went to visit him and said, Ron, I'm retiring. If you don't get your study done, you may not find somebody else who feels competent to guide you through the process, and that's it. So I went to my employer and I said, well, Elder Keys, what should I do? I've been working on this, but when I went to that conference working in Arizona, I had gone there as semi-retired, and I had one church 18 hours a week, and I was going to work on the thesis. Within 6 weeks of arriving, settling in, the president said to me, would you go full-time?
Wow.
So I said, okay. And so I kind of said to him, if I'd remained part-time, I could have gotten this done, which was true. I've been full-time in churches now in that district, and I didn't get it done. My professor's retiring, and he just told me, get it done, or else you may never get it done.
Yes.
So he was very gracious. He said, okay, for the next 5-6 months, only preach on weekends and take care of life or death emergencies. So that was it. I then dived into this study. So again, I'm grateful to God for sustaining me. And I want to say I'm thankful to Linda, my wife, because, this was a crisis for her. Right. And the Lord is blessed and and she's healthy and strong. And I even took her as a part of the celebration. We went and I trained her, and she did the Chicago Marathon, the 42.2, 2 or 3 years after her cancer, after surgery. So I was her trainer and did that celebration. And then, of course, a few years later, before she was in remission. And so I'm thankful to my wife, Linda. And of course, to my teachers, so many wonderful people who motivated me. From my 7th grade, I remember a key person who motivated me, a South African, motivated me to see that I could dig and study. And then I'm grateful for many friends. I appreciate so many friends because my study is here in Cape Town. I'm living in the United States. So even though I didn't have to come, I had many opportunities to come and speak. And when I would come, I would try to bring a chapter or visit with my professor, get his counsel, and then I would stay with friends. And there have been so many gracious friends that I have stayed with over the course of the last 5 years, but mainly the last 2. As I've been scrambling to get this done. So that's part of the journey. And of course, my parents most definitely were inspirational, and my uncle and aunt. So I've got from that side very supportive people. Both my parents and my uncle and aunt have passed away. But I have had many people helping me, encouraging me to dig deeply in this very important topic.
What will we do without family and friends?
That's
and
right.
Their support.
Correct. And that's if you have a supportive network, then you can start digging in, and you can spend time searching as you got that. If you have to run it alone and you have people against you, it's very hard. So I just want to say to all those who've been helping me, I'm looking at you right now. Thank you for all your kindness, your encouragement from my professor, teachers, family, and friends, and mostly to God.
Amen. Now, Colossians 2 verse 16, it says, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holiday or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days. Now, this is the King James Version.
Correct.
So, yeah, Please lead us in the study.
Well, again, as I said, if you don't know the Hebrew and the Greek, then you go and check multiple translations, and you can even read commentaries that make comments on this text. I prefer the New King James, because if you look at the New King James and you compare it with all known Greek manuscripts, the New King James is closer. There's no perfect English translation, because that's why we have multiple English translations, but it's closer and it's more modern language. So so it starts very similar. So let no one judge you. Very similar. Let no man therefore judge you. And then King James says in meat. New King James says in food. Because Old English 400 something years ago, they used the word meat for food. And the word there is food. Or in drink. And the literal translations have food and drink.
Now, just a question: is this referring to a sacrificial system, or this is just normal eating and drinking?
Well, this is part of what my thesis is about. I have a whole section on that. See, on these two important words. But the interesting thing
is, that's basically giving context.
Yes, correct. Giving context to this idea, because the newer, the more paraphrased or the more dynamic translations, like the New International Version. The New International Version says by what you eat or drink.
Exactly. So that context is basically removed.
Yes, it's different. And even the New Living Translation says for what you eat or drink. So it goes to a general thing of you can eat anything, you can drink anything. But what's interesting, and I found it pretty consistent, the literal translations, the formal ones, King James, New King James, Revised Standard Version, multiple, New American Standard, they go with food and drink. They don't by what you eat or what you drink. It's fascinating. So I encourage people, if you're going to do a Bible study and you don't know the original languages, use a more formal literal translation. Now, King James, unfortunately, we don't use the words the same anymore. So that's why I recommend New King James. They're very close, but this is more modern language. Like instead of meat, it's the word food. So that's the difference there. That's the first difference. Or regarding the New King James, the King James says holy days, right?
Yes.
Or in respect of an holy day. And holy day is very general. But actually the word there is heorte, which is the word feast or festival. And the New King James is regarding a festival. And it's a most fascinating thing, which I hope I can get into later on. But this word festival has been so misunderstood. I'm amazed. Even people who have done their doctoral study have not correctly identified this, because it wasn't the focus of their study.
Exactly.
See, they're focusing on other things, and then they claim they're dealing with the text, but they deal with it because it's not their focus. They deal with it kind of superficially because it's not their main focus. And so they just copy what others have said instead of going back and asking the question, what does the word heorte mean? And it's amazing. And so here's one of the major confusions across the board. The assumption is that the word festival simply means an annual feast day. And that is not true. It does not simply mean an annual feast day. It's a completely wrong assumption. And fortunately, there are many scholars who recognize that. Lexicographers, it's just incredible. The dictionaries support what I will be sharing.
Just because of an assumption.
It's an assumption by, I would say, the majority of people who've written on this. And when I say the majority, for my thesis, I wanted to be as exhaustive as possible. So I went to many libraries, from the Library of Congress in the United States to one of the richest resources for Sabbatarian literature, Andrews University in Michigan, to multiple libraries, probably about a dozen on the West Coast, Fuller Theological Library. I went and scoured the libraries. And I was able to get together close to 200 sets of Bible commentaries, that deal with this verse. 164 of them that specifically talk about feast, new moon, Sabbath. And 138 that claim to do a careful study of those three words. And 133 of whom say it is annual. 133 commentaries say this is annual. Basically all annual festivals of ancient Israel. 133 of them. And more than 50% of those 133 commentaries written by people from all different backgrounds, different denominations, it's amazing. 133 of those commentary sets, more than 50% do no exegesis, no linguistic study. It's all an assumption. It's amazing. And those who do linguistic study do a superficial one. So my study, at one stage, I said, no one has done any work on this. But then somebody said, you can't say that. All you can say is that there is no evidence, because maybe they did the study, but they never put it in what they produced. So I say there is no published evidence available for all of the 133 Bible commentaries that say this is annual festivals. Okay. They just say it's all annual festivals, and there's no support in the dictionaries for that. If you proper dictionaries, now there are what I call the pocket dictionaries. Little side story here. Just today at the end of graduation, as I came out, somebody I'd never met walked up to me and he said, "Congratulations and thank you for inspiring me. You have 3 doctoral degrees." And I said, "Yes, but my wife and I have no kids. These are our daughters, onze dochter geraden in Afrikaans." I played on that, and I chatted with him, and he said to me, "You have just overturned. You have just shown that Strong's and Vine are wrong." And I said, well,
even concordances can be wrong.
They are dictionaries and concordances. I said, we have to go back to the text. And said, I am dependent not on Strong's. Strong's was published in 1899. I'm not dependent on the dictionary. I have to go back and say, intertextually, how does the Bible use these words? I said, I went back to every time the word Shabbat is found in the Old Testament, Hebrew. I went to every time the word is used in the translated Old Testament, which is often called the Septuagint, the general understanding, the LXX, the scholars say. I went to every time the word was there in the Greek, and then I went to every usage of the word Sabbata or Sabbaton in the New. And I found out that Strong's is very deficient. Strong's gives 1 definition, I believe, of the Hebrew and 2 definitions of the Greek, and yet there are 4 definitions of the Hebrew and 4 of the Greek. So they give you so little, and then you make wrong conclusions based upon incorrect definitions. And this guy caught it. We read the summary in the graduation ceremony book, and he said, after hearing that, as it was presented, he said, man, Strong's and Vines, they got to be corrected now. So I said, it's not me. I have to be faithful to the way the words are used in the text. So the first word is not simply annual festivals.
So according to your study, what is it then?
Well, my study and a plethora, multiple sources of Sunday keeping scholars say that they recognize and this is what they call pilgrimage festivals. It's and as scholars say, the word heorte is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word chag, and chag translated in English is an H with a dot under it, in your throat, and then an A and a G with a line under it, chag. Okay, if you want to be very precise, and that is very close to the Muslim word hajj, because Arabic, it's a Semitic language. You have Hebrew, cousin language, Aramaic, and then Arabic, more of a distant cousin. And so what's the Hajj? It's a pilgrimage to Mecca. And so you see, when you go and you study the ancient Jewish, what happened in the Old Testament, 3 times per year, all Jewish males were required to make a pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. And these are the Chag, or Chagim is plural. And these are also Heorte, the Greek word that's here. These are pilgrimage festivals. It includes only Passover / unleavened bread. Passover was the 14th day of the first month, okay? Abib. And then from the 15th day till the 21st, there's the 7 days of unleavened bread. Those 8 days, they went up there for Passover, they stayed for unleavened bread. That 8-day festival, which even in the New Testament, Luke says the Passover, also called Feast of Unleavened Bread, or vice versa. So they just use the word Passover. So that's the one time all males had to go.
Correct.
Okay, and then they go back springtime, and then close in summer, they went up for Pentecost, which is a 1-day festival. Again, all Jewish males, circumcised men, had to go up there, major, for 1 day, Pentecost. And then they came back, and then Tabernacles, which is, again, incidentally, an 8-day celebration. 7 days from the 7th month of the Jewish calendar, the 15th to the 21st, and the 22nd day was the 8th day.
So you have 8-1-8.
Correct. You have a chiastic structure, which is what the scholars call. You have 8-1-8. Okay, with Pentecost in the middle. Fascinating. So it's like, wow. And if you read the Bible, it's clear. These are the only times that Jewish males had to, and they went to their families,
Yes.
obviously. Jesus was a child. He went over with Joseph and Mary
Yes.
up there, with his mother and quote unquote adoptive father. They went up to Jerusalem for Passover. These were the pilgrimage festivals. And I didn't find one scholar who knew his worth and knew his work who suggested that. I mean, looking at the lexicographers, looking at the dictionaries, and looking at the actual meaning of the word, I went through the entire New Testament to see how the word heorte is used. It's found 27 times in the New Testament. And besides this time, 26 times. And it is used of pilgrimage festivals. And the best we know, including footnotes by other scholars, it's mostly used for Passover and leavened bread, secondarily for tabernacles, and then once probably for Pentecost.
So why is it important that it's a pilgrimage and not an annual feast?
Well, it is. No, what I said, not simply. That's the key word. I said it's not simply an annual feast. It is an annual feast, but it is a specific kind of annual feast. Heorte is used of the pilgrimage festivals because there were other times that were sacred times also. Many know the most important day of the Jewish year is Yom Kippur. It's well known. It's and you can see it in many calendars. It's Yom Kippur.
Yes.
That's the most sacred day, the Day of Atonement. But there's no requirement. You don't go up to Jerusalem for that. And it's fascinating because Yom Kippur is not included in the word festival. Never is. So it's an amazing study. Heorte is a limited, and that's scholars who say that, and I agree. From a word study of the New Testament, I show that Heorte never includes a Day of Atonement. Fascinating. So we must say, so the first word there is a festival. And the best way to say is a pilgrimage festival. And it's interesting, the Revised English Bible, when it's in the book of Hosea, when they have a similar triad, it says a pilgrimage. Same idea. New English Bible, Revised English Bible, and one more. I think the Voice, if I'm correct. I may forget. I've gotten about 60 Bibles that I've used, translated, Bibles, plus Afrikaans, plus Dutch that I've referred to in my thesis. So, and I go back to the original. So the word is a pilgrimage festival. And once you correctly identify the first term, it solves a multitude of problems, I believe, because the claim is inaccurate. These are simply all annual festivals. There's no support linguistically, exegetically, etc. in the New Testament, and even with Old Testament links. There's no support for that. So there's a major flaw of the assumptions made by people.
Which cause us to realize that assumption is dangerous. So when we get into a Bible study or into exposition, whatever format, we need to put aside our preconceived ideas.
Correct.
And look at the text and the original wording.
Right. Very important, especially on a challenging text and like this one, because if you think about it, why is Colossians 2:16, quote unquote, so important? It's the only text in the New Testament, the only one that talks about the word sabbata. That's the dictionary term or lexical term, sabbata. The only one in the entire New Testament that talks about it in a theological context. All of the others are in historical context. Correct. Jesus went into the synagogue on
Luke 4:16,
and all those, that's in the Gospels and then in the book of Acts, just the practice of people. And this is the one that gives counsel about this word sabbata. So it's in the theological portion, and it's talked about what to do about it. Let no man judge you concerning the word heorte there, feast, and then new moons, neomania, and then sabbata. Those are the lexical words.
Yeah, so it says here a holy day or feast.
Feast, correct.
Or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days.
Okay, before we get to that last term, we'll keep that for the second section, because that's the most, but let me go on to new moons. Fascinating. I had to learn so much of this. I thought I'd gone to school. Oh man, just to go into it. The word new moons there, virtually nobody debates that. It's neomania, or sometimes written pneumania, but it's the only time in the entire New Testament that this word appears. Nowhere else in the New Testament.
Really?
Never. Yes. Neomania is unique.
But it's the same like in Isaiah 66, for instance.
No, it's not. Fascinatingly, it's
and,
not.
And that's quite crucial.
That is crucial, yes. Yeah. Now, that's the Hebrew word chodesh, which appears 283 times in the Old Testament, and there's lots of dictionary and serious scholars, and I'm talking about I'm not talking about the peripheral ones who just scratch the surface or dig maybe 10 centimeters down. But those who go down to bedrock, there's pretty much agreement. Chodesh is a Hebrew word which is used mostly not for new moons. It's just used for the word month. It's the regular word for month.
From month to month.
It's from month to month and from Sabbath to Sabbath. It's got nothing to do with the new moon celebration, which is the first day of the new moon. It's not there. It's fascinating. And I have multiple Bibles that show that all the way from the Geneva Bible. Okay.
So according to your study and your research, there's no correlation between Isaiah 66 and this verse?
No, except for similar sounding words in the English strands, but you can't connect
because
them.
I heard some Sunday keeping pastors using that text to show basically that, okay, there's new moon, there's Sabbath days, and here's new moon and Sabbath days.
Right. No, these are not connected. It's hard. Again,
in the normal language, it makes sense.
In the normal language, yes. But it's here's a little difference. Like even in English, we talk about peanut butter and jam. They go together. Or spaghetti and meatballs.
Yes,
they go together.
Yes.
This is when you have new moon and Sabbath. That's a couplet. That's called a couplet. And every time new moon is put with Sabbath, okay, and if in the context it is new moon and Sabbath, if it says new moon Sabbath, not from month to month and from Sabbath to Sabbath, but when it just talks about new moon and Sabbath together, when they're close together, new moon Sabbath, it is the first day of the month and the 7th-day Sabbath. But this is from month to month and from Sabbath to Sabbath. This is not that kind. I call it the double. It appears twice, but it's new moon on its own, which is really month to month.
Yes.
And the top scholars agree it's month to month and Sabbath to Sabbath. And the Sabbath to Sabbath is the 7th-day Sabbath in the text, but that is month to month. It's amazing how much evidence there is for that. And I wasn't even aware of this until I got into the study. It's just wow. Now in Isaiah 1, it has, I hate your new moon and Sabbath. That's put together as a couplet. See? And so that's new moon, first day of the month, and 7th-day Sabbath, where God is speaking. And the context is because of the way they were abusing. They were simply serving God with their lips, but not with their hearts. Jesus talks about it in later on about, he quotes Isaiah. So that's why God hates this lip service. And it is talking about new moon days, and it is talking about 7th-day Sabbath.
Dr. Priya, some theologians are going to disagree with you. So we need to get in another program to get into the depth of this.
Oh, okay.
And we really invite you to tune into the next program where we'll get into depth of this verse, especially focusing on this. Is it the Sabbath days, plural? This Sabbath, a Sabbath, Sabbath.
Yes,
what is this?
Okay.
And in which context? And then also crucial to me, what is the objections? And what did your study reveal to the specific objections raised in this verse?
Yes, and you say another hour. We need about at least, I'd say 10 hours more. But we'll try to squeeze it into one.
We're going to squeeze 30 years into 1 hour.
Okay, yes, that's right. But we began to touch the surface by pointing out that festival is pilgrimage festivals.
Yes. That's quite crucial. Yes. Thank you for tuning in to the program Dynamic. In the next program, we'll continue with the study and we'll get into depth. May God bless you. Until next time.
The Federal Reserve Bank of New York just issued a digital dollar, effectively replacing
Welcome to our program, Dynamic. With me today again is Pastor Dr. de Priya. Good day.
Good day.
Welcome on the program.
Thank you.
Welcome to the show today. Now, this is not a show that's actually Bible study that we're going to do today, but just a question. just to start off with, scholars or scripture?
Yes, that's a key question. I am a scholar, so in the sense, it's the scripture rather than the scholars, because it's as Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 verse
Study to
15.
show you
Uh,
approved.
that's 2:15. Study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that doesn't need to be ashamed,
Mhm.
rightly dividing the word of truth. Each one of us is personally accountable to
Yes.
spend time in the word,
Yes.
because the next chapter, chapter 3 verse 15,
Yes.
they point you to Jesus Christ, where we get salvation by grace through faith in Jesus. So sometimes we have to make a choice between the scholar and the scripture.
But you can get a scriptural scholar.
You can, yes. Hopefully the scholars will all be solidly scriptural.
Yes.
See,
yes.
that's the thing. But unfortunately, sometimes, and guilty as charged at times, because one of my books, that first one
Yes,
that
yes.
you showed, no, the second one, and
Yes.
No Fear for the Future.
Yes, no fear of
Okay,
the future. Yes.
that one, a little confession here.
Yes.
One of the chapters I have changed my mind on.
Oh,
it.
really?
Yes, and so when
But it's good to know, that
Yes.
we are not infallible.
No.
We study, and the more we study, the more we experience truth.
Correct. Now, but here's the reason I was wrong. This is a very good lesson I learned, but the reason I was wrong was I was just studying it for myself.
Which chapter?
I'm not going to tell you. I'll tell you
I'm
later.
so curious
I'll tell
now.
you later on. It'll distract us from the thing. But the point I'm making is, you see, I found out later on that when Jesus was talking to his disciples in John chapter 14, 15, 16, and he
Yes.
says, I'm going to send you another comforter. And then he says, he will guide you into all truth. And that it's said twice. And the you there, I didn't realize it's a you plural in the Greek. It's not you singular. He was talking to his disciples as the corporate beginning of the church.
Wow.
The Holy Spirit will guide the Christian church into truth,
Wow.
corporately. Now, it doesn't mean individually we cannot study the Bible, but we need each other.
Yes.
And the reason I was wrong on one chapter, I simply did my own study, and I pretty much ignored what others had done. And that's the danger when we think we can all find truth for ourselves individually. God raised up a corporate body, koinonia,
Absolutely.
fellowship. That's why
Fellowship.
important.
Body of believers.
That's right, and we need each other. You see,
There is wisdom in the multiple counsels.
correct. And you see, that was a tough lesson I had to learn. I should have listened, checked others out, and it would showed me the flaw I made in one chapter. And so when I sell that nowadays, I tell people, I'll give you a discount of $1 because that one chapter I have now discarded. I've not taken it out yet because I still have copies to get rid of. But so there's a discount for that chapter. But again, the point is we must be willing to keep growing. And, so it's not the scholars versus the scripture,
Yes.
unless the scholars
Yes.
don't go with the scripture.
How did you find, scholars in terms of Colossians chapter 2 verse 16? It says, let no man therefore judge you in food or in drink or in regard to a festival of the new moon of Sabbath days.
Yeah, yes, this is an amazing, the overwhelming majority. By my calculation, about 95% of Bible commentaries that I could find, and most were in English, but I tried to go beyond. So I have probably about 10 languages of stuff that I tried to find because I wanted to be exhaustive.
Yes.
And not boasting, but I wanted to get this issue solved. Because it's been around for 1,800 years, from the time of Irenaeus.
Wow.
He used this, and we'll
Wow.
talk about that more. But I try to be totally exhaustive, so I have over 1,000 sources that I actually quote and use. I'm not even including in my bibliography the sources that I read and studied but I didn't quote. So, I try to look at everything, but 95% of Bible commentaries I could locate say it's the seventh-day Sabbath in the text. 5% say it is not, which is only about 5 commentaries, less than 5%. 5 commentaries out of 138, 133 say it's a 7-day Sabbath, and 5 say it's not. Sure. So the majority, and again, the question is, should we go with the majority? A story about a personal friend of mine. He was a 7th-day Sabbatarian, and he left the 7th-day Sabbatarian fellowship, and he started a Sunday keeping church. Yeah. And he's a friend, so I went and visited him one day at his Sunday church, and I took along my ugly book, the little one that I first had way back a decade ago. And as we were chatting, I said, hey, if you have a chance, go ahead. Or I mailed it to him. I don't know how, but he's a friend, so I sent it to him. And he read it through, cover to cover. Not many pages, 76. And he wrote back to me, and he said, Ron, you're a much more careful Bible student than I am. Then he added, however, you yourself say 95% of commentaries say it's the seventh-day Sabbath, and I prefer to go with the majority. And so I wrote back to him. He's a buddy. He still is. I wrote back. I said, you know what? I would love to go with the majority. My problem with the majority is they are not faithful to the text.
Wow.
I want to be faithful to
That's
the
a
text.
bold statement.
Yeah, I want to be faithful to the text of Scripture. And so this is part of the reason I came and studied at University of Western Cape. And part of the reason I selected a Dutch Reformed pastor.
What?
Yes, Dutch Reformed scholar and a gracious gentleman. And I had a wonderful working relationship for, since I first contacted him. And we've worked together. And at the end of the graduation to today, we stood there by the snack table, and we just chit-chatted like we were friends. And we are. I really believe we are. Even though he was my advisor, we had a wonderful discussion and so forth. And he kind of kidded. And he said, and what's your fourth doctorate going to be on? I said, no, I don't think so. Anyway, but yeah, so this is the reality. And he's a Dutch Reformed scholar. And I appreciated him because one of the reasons I chose the University of the Western Cape, specifically Professor Laurie, because back then when he said, yeah, I believe the Bible has objective truth. I had visited another institution that will remain unnamed, and I wanted to go there, very prestigious, many years ago. And one of the professors said to me, well, we are postmodern at this institution. And, it's your opinion versus my opinion. There's no such a thing as truth. Objective truth. Absolute truth. When I heard that at this prestigious university that granted doctoral degrees in theology, I said, thank you. And I left, but no thanks. Hence, I went there. And when this Dutch Reformed scholar told me, oh, yeah, we can find stuff here. Now, as scholars, we have to be respectful. That's why we use the terms as far as I have been able to seem,
because none of us knows everything.
Correct. And so in my abstract, I say, I'll just give you a quick sentence.
I really want to listen.
Here's the abstract, and you'll see how I phrased it. This is the final paragraph of the abstract, and then we get into the nitty-gritty. But the final paragraph says, approaching the final form of the canon, I'm addressing saying that I'm not getting into discussions of what they call historical critical methodologies or reader response theories and all those. I'm just saying I accept it as it stands to study it as it is. See, that's the first thing. So approaching the final form of the canon, the 66 books, why did I say it? From a Protestant perspective. So I'm looking at the 66 books, the 39 in the Old Testament and the 27 in the New. So that's the first part. Approaching the final form of the canon from a Protestant perspective and operating within the essential principles of the historico-grammatical hermeneutic. This thesis seeks to meticulously analyze the meaning of Sabbata, which is the dictionary term, especially as it appears in the triad of feast, new moon, Sabbath. Okay, that's the first sentence of the last paragraph. Now the last sentence. Taking into account the theme and setting of this epistle, it seems, scholarly language, there is sufficient contextual, intertextual, etymological, lexical, linguistic, semantic, syntactical, structural, and typological data to reasonably conclude that the Sabbaton, the actual form of the word, the Sabbaton of Colossians 2:16 does not refer to the seventh-day Sabbath. So there's that.
And that's not just a bold statement. That is based on your research and your finding.
Correct. 30 years I've been in the text and my research now at the University of the Western Cape. And again, I want to, thankful for my Dutch Reformed scholar when I studied at, and of course, this is my study, but he was a great guide, helpful. And when I studied at the University of South Africa, I had a Methodist professor. Len Hulley was my guide for my DTH in theological ethics. So, God has wonderful Christians who willing to work together. And we want to go back and say, what does the text say? That's the key point.
That's the key point. So why is this question of the Sabbath in this passage so vital for Bible-believing Christians?
Yes, it's vital because, number one, it has been debated. The earliest debate on the issue of the seventh-day Sabbath that I could locate was from the writings of Irenaeus. And he lived approximately 130 to 200.
Church father.
And so literally about a century after the book was written, and I have a whole chapter on who wrote it most likely, and I suggest there's enough evidence that Paul was the author. And there's still debate among scholars, but I take care of all those questions sufficiently. So 100 years after it was written, Irenaeus says this text shows there's no reason to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. That's as early as it goes. And so one scholar has said it this way. He wrote back in 1880 and pretty much captured, which has been mostly the argument over the last, I'd say, 140 years, close to that. He said this. His name was William Love. Some Seventh-day Sabbatarians acknowledge that if the word Sabbaths in this verse does refer to the seventh day, then that settles the case against them. See? And all, his words, non-Sabbath Lord's Day men, those who keep Sunday, or might well acknowledge that if this verse does not teach that the fourth commandment is abolished, then the case is settled against them.
That's excellent statement.
Yes. Okay, that's his thing. And so he then said, this text, his same guy, William Love, this text, by its true meaning, has the key to the right understanding of the scriptures pertaining to the Sabbath.
Wow.
It's this pivotal passage.
Okay, so you referred now to Irenaeus, you referred now to William Love.
Yes.
It's like centuries apart,
Correct. Oh, yes.
more than millennia. So what is now, is there sufficient material spread across the centuries in the Christian church?
Oh, yeah. We got Augustine, we got Calvin, we got Luther, and we got
who wrote upon this text?
Who didn't write on it necessarily, but said that
or
this
referred
text,
to it.
This text shows that the Sabbath is no longer to be kept. And then I track scholars all the way through. I go back 1595. After the 1595, Nicholas Bound uses the text. 1636, 1729, every century. And I select to show 1729, 1899, then 1900, Paul Jewett. Paul made it very plain that the Gentile Christians had no obligation to observe the Sabbath. Okay?
So basically the majority wrote that this text shows us we don't need to keep the seventh-day Sabbath.
Right. That's why William Love captured it beautifully with that statement, says this is it. And even amazingly, there was a man who belonged to a Sabbatarian group, and he says in the year 2000, he was an Old Testament professor, he said this: the Sabbatarian perspective is clearly negated in view of this remarkable passage. So I tracked through the centuries, and these are just selected quotes. This is my introductory. This is on page 3 and 4, 2, 3, and just at the beginning, page 1, 2, 3, 4.
It's a basic overview.
Just a quick overview, and then I go into it and I show how it's been used. And I try to be exhaustive. Professor Laurie one day said to me as I was in his office, he said, "Ron, abandon the grandiose." I looked at him, I said, "What did you just say?" He said, "Abandon the grandiose. Don't try to cover everything." But you know what? I couldn't resist the temptation. So I went and tried to be exhaustive. And I looked for every published printable thing I could find everywhere. I even went to online sources. I didn't cover everything because online, many of the things are just people's personal opinions, but I try to cover everything. So that's why this thing, I quote over 1,000 sources, including about 60 Bibles. Wow. So yeah, I have a pretty good overview, and he did say, "Ron, you have captured the key people at different times." He said, it's my third doctorate. I think I have an understanding of digging and studying in academia.
Now, to basically put us, into this topic, could you maybe just explain to us the different types of Sabbaths, being dealt with in various passages?
Yes. Now, this is key. That's why this man who said you kind of showing Vine and Strong's up by your study, those dictionaries and concordances don't give you the full picture. It's like what I call a little pocket dictionary.
It's more for laymen.
It is, but it is so restricted, it gives you the wrong impression. So if you open up and say Sabbath means seventh-day Sabbath, that's the only definition they may give you. And yet it's not correct. It's like, firstly in English, if I say fast,
Yes.
What does it mean? Well, give me a sentence.
I'm on
You're on a fast. That's right, but that's without food. But let's say as an adjective. I should have been more precise.
Yes.
He runs fast.
Yes.
Oh, I said, but I thought somebody just said the guy stood fast. How can he run fast and stand fast at the same time? Well, he ran fast while he was standing fast on principle. It's the same word, so when you realize that in every language there are words that are used in more than one way.
Yes.
And as you go into the text and look at the Hebrew, it's amazing. The word Shabbat,
Yes.
according to the Hebrew, is used in 4 different ways. But if you look at Strong's or one of them, they might say it's seventh-day Sabbath and miss out the other ways. Now, it is true, 85.5% of the time, it does mean seventh-day Sabbath. But almost 15% of the time, it means something else. And so, so people at a discussion I had once said, how do you know which Sabbath it is? And I have concluded it's not by what is common, but by what is uncommon, because every word is couched in certain contexts.
Please do elaborate on that.
Okay. Like the word fast. If I just say fast, when I say runs fast, the word means speedy. If I say stand fast, that means he's a principled man. And in English, we even say that's a fast woman. Beware. That means she's not principled. Okay. You see how the language is fascinating. But so the same thing here. There are terms around the word Shabbat that help us to understand what it is all about. Now, the commonalities is, firstly, it's the same word Shabbat. And it's a day on which Jews either had to refrain from all work, as in seventh-day Sabbath, going back to the time of the, and of course Sabbath goes before that, but starting from Adam's time, when we see that, and even Walter Kaiser, a Lutheran professor, says that all of the 10 commandments are to be found in Genesis, including the seventh-day Sabbath. That's Walter Kaiser, and he said that back in the 1980s. His book Toward Old Testament Ethics. I've had the privilege of meeting Dr. Kaiser. I think he's passed away. I'm not sure, but because back then, when I was doing my study, he was already a senior. You know what I mean? But Dr. Kaiser points out that all the 10 commandments are in Genesis, which means beforehand. That's we don't have to wait till we get to Exodus and the giving of the law. And he's right. Other scholars recognize that. But so if we're looking at from the Jewish perspective, they didn't only keep the Sabbath that was given to Adam and Eve and really to all humankind as we understand it, but they also kept what we sometimes call ceremonial Sabbaths, specifically Yom Kippur, or ritual Sabbaths, or cultic Sabbaths, the scholar's language. But Yom Kippur is such a holy day, no work was to be done at all. Okay, so that is common. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, is in a sense the same as the seventh-day Sabbath. The one is an annual one, Yom Kippur, and the one is a weekly one. Okay, but that's common. But to what I had realized, I had to not just look for what's common, I had to look for what's uncommon. If I play a game with you, maybe 20 questions, that one of the games I've learned, and I say, what am I thinking of? Number 1, it's a fruit. Number 2, it's round.
Yes.
Number 3, it's green.
Okay.
Number 4, it's got seeds inside. Number 5, it's sweet.
Apple.
It could be an apple, okay, but I may be thinking of a melon. You see that? Or if I say it's oblong, what do you know?
Oh, that's a watermelon.
Correct. You see, I have to go beyond that. Or if I'm thinking of melon, then if I added it grows on the ground, then apples don't. Then you realize apple would be wrong. So there are multiple similarities, but when you get to the dissimilarities, that is what helps you to know what fruit I'm thinking of.
To distinguish.
Correct, to distinguish that.
It's almost like today science tells us that we are related to chimpanzees 97%.
Yes.
But it's in the dissimilarities
Correct.
where we can see the difference.
Correct. And that's most important when in my study of this too. So you have to say what is dissimilar. And this is what I came across, and I used multiple scholars over the centuries because different ones found a few things. Some things I found in my own study which are unique and ties in. But one of the things that's important as I went through the Old Testament, the Hebrew text, and again, only in the Hebrew, not in the English. The English is not consistent. The Hebrew is consistent. My study, and I've outlined it in tables and in charts. I got 15 tables in my thesis. And I've shown that if you go to it, the word the in Hebrew, before the word Shabbat.
Yes, because here in Colossians chapter 2, verse 16, it says, Let no man therefore judge you in food or in drink, or in regard of a festival, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath.
Yeah,
And
you got the
then
word there, all right? That's not so good. Don't go to the next word. The next word is days in italics.
Yes,
We'll
yes.
get to that. Now, most people are aware.
The Sabbath.
Yeah, when you see the word in italics, I mean, many
Yeah, no,
people
it's
say
not in the original.
it's not in the original. That's well recognized by many
Yes.
people in the pew, as we say. So the translators added days and they put in italics. But the word the is also found in no Greek manuscripts. And even Fawcett and what's his name, Brown, who admit, and they say the word the is not in the Greek. And if you look at it, there's no Greek manuscript to support the word the. This is one of the reasons I prefer the New King James, because the New King James simply said or Sabbaths. Okay.
Wow.
Now we'll get to the issue of is it singular or plural later on, but it simply says or. The word the, no Greek manuscript supports that. All of my study couldn't find a single supportive. And so most modern translations say they leave the word the out.
That's quite significant.
It is significant because with the word the there, in the Old and New Testament, when you have the Greek word, which is, tone in the plural, tone, Sabbaton, Jesus went into the synagogue on the Sabbaths, and of course it's in the plural form. It's tone, Sabbaton. The word, there's no word the in any manuscript. And unfortunately, the King James confuses people. But again, if you know, you got to go back to the original. And if you check many translations, you'll see the translators. And there is at least one King James version that somebody brought to me at a presentation once. Said, look, my Bible, King James version, has the word the in italics. Oh. I said, what is that? That's the Thomas Newberry edition of the King James version. They made sure it's in italics so the reader would know there's no Greek support for that. So the first thing I found in my study is that in the Hebrew, when the word ha is there, ha Shabbat, yes. It's always seventh-day Sabbath. And you can see it from the rest of the context, without a doubt, if the word ha is there. If the word ha isn't there, it may be the seventh-day Sabbath.
But depending on the context.
Correct. Or there may be other words, like yom. Yom is the word day. If it's directly connected with ha Shabbat, okay, then it is the seventh-day Sabbath. Yeah, the Sabbath day, both in the Old and the New. And it was an amazing discovery. And again, I lean on other scholars, but I went back and I checked every text in the Hebrew and in the Greek. And I found that totally consistent. There are multiple terms. And so I went through, page after page of analyzing it with footnotes. Here, I only have a heading and the entire page is a footnote. It's a whole footnote. A footnote becomes almost a head note because of that. Looked at everything and I found out, and that is totally consistent with these, showing you the distinctiveness. We now know without a doubt. And I am suggesting that, when God inspired the scriptures, he inspired the writers to write with what I call critical clarity of communication.
I need to write that down. I like that phrase, yes. Critical clarity of communication.
Because he wanted us to understand what he meant by what he said. See, whether you are one who believes in verbal, mechanical dictation or thought inspiration, regardless, if you believe that the Bible was inspired, it was inspired for a purpose.
To be clear.
To be clear for us to understand his will. And all of the great truths necessary for salvation are as clear as noonday.
Deuteronomy 29:29. It's revealed for us and our children.
Correct. You see? And that's why we're encouraged to study the word. Now, there are other things that may not be as clear, but critical things like stuff that deal with the 10 Commandments, written by the finger of God. Wow, the 10 Commandments, obviously, most Christians say, we believe the 10 Commandments are important. And this is one of them. You see?
but Peter reminds us, some things of Paul is a bit difficult, and maybe this verse is under that heading.
Yes, and in fact, I say it is. It is a tough text.
Yes.
And people say, but it's only one text. Some say, it's only one text. And I say, I know it's only one text. Sometimes, though, one text is crucial, such as there's only one mention of the millennium in the entire Bible.
Absolutely.
Revelation chapter 20, verses 2-7.
But it can, a whole doctrine can consist of that.
Correct, exactly.
Passage.
So there are times that one text is pivotal in the study of Scripture. And so I said this is as important as the millennium issue, regardless of what kind of a millennium, because most Christians understand there is a millennium.
Like Genesis 1:1, God created.
Yes, right. There's a pivotal text. This is a pivotal text. See, so that's important in our recognition of all of this. So anyway, that gives you, and here are some of the words. Keep. If the word keep is there, then it's also seventh day.
Okay.
The word keep is unique. day,
Yes.
holy. Those are 4 words that differentiate it. And if those words are not directly connected with Shabbat, then it is some other thing, such as Yom Kippur, or it's used for the whole week, or it is used for other things, the sabbatical years. Fascinating. So that's helpful, and it helped me to understand what differentiates it.
Now, speaking about feasts, what is this connection between the Sabbath or Sabbaths and now feast days in Leviticus 23?
Yes. Oh, you know what? When I finished this second book that we mentioned here,
Yes.
Judging the Sabbath, Discovering
Yes.
What Can't Be Found in Colossians, there were at least 7 book reviews in professional journals that I was able to locate,
Oh, really?
online or in print. And half were positive, half were negative, as in, supportive and like the study, and others were saying, no, he hasn't done a complete study, he hasn't a full study. And I was thankful that my advisor, Professor Laurie said to me, go ahead and publish. And then you can get input and critiques. And he said, and then later on, you can even quote yourself in your thesis, because it's an academic publication. And, to have an academic publication, it went through outside referees who had to recommend whether to publish it or not. And not all of them were of our faith. And then he added with a smile, he said, and you can even refute yourself in your thesis.
I like that.
So it is right, because
it's about study,
correct,
discovering.
Right. We have to be willing to dig deeper into the text. So there were serious critiques that came on 2 issues, one of which was this one, Leviticus 23. Because if you read on the surface, just quickly reading it, the first Leviticus 23, verse 2 and verse 3, if you start there, and again, I want to read from the New King James.
Yes.
On this, I'm not sure if the King James is an issue as such, but since we want to use New King James, it's in our language of today, more so. Unless, of course, you studied Shakespeare in English, because some people know that well. But listen what it says: "Speak to the children of Israel." This is God speaking to Moses, and say to them, "The feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts." That's Hagim, the plural. That's Moedim. That's another word, Moedim, a broader term. And I love the Jewish Bible there, Jewish Publication Society, JPS, and they say, these are my appointed seasons. Now, that's the best translation. The problem in English, we don't have an English word. I've never found it in all of my study. There's an English word for moed, singular, or moedim, plural. And most translations simply say feast, which is inaccurate. And we think it's the word feast. It's not. These are my moedim.
Oh.
And so some of my feast-keeping friends, they actually use the Hebrew word because there's no English. We must keep God's moedim. They say it regularly, because it's not the word for feast. And my feast-keeping friends are right about the word. They don't use the word feast because it's wrong. Even the New King James is wrong. And you can find that. So the JPS, Jewish Publication Society, say appointed seasons. And 1 or 2 Bibles are close to that. But this is the most consistent one, written and translated. Consistent, amazingly consistent. And it's a Jewish Publication Society. They write about the Hebrew. So it's amazing. These are my appointed seasons. Okay. It starts with the appointed seasons of the Lord. These are my appointed seasons. Now, verse 3, 6 days you shall work be done. But notice the 7th day. Okay, the day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. There's holy again. Also, another key word, linking word. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. And so, wait a minute. God just said to Moses, these are my solemn moedim. And then the next verse, he gives the 7th-day Sabbath. And they say, look, the 7th-day Sabbath is one of God's moedim. And it's a real challenge. So I ended up doing another entire chapter that I had never planned in my thesis, and dealing with the moedim. Is the 7th-day Sabbath one of the appointed seasons? Yes or no? You see, again, a quick study will get you to that conclusion.
And that's quite crucial, because if it is, we don't need to keep the Sabbath in the New Testament.
Correct.
According to Colossians 2:16.
It's set aside in Colossians 2:16 if it's part of it. Yes. Oh, and it was another major study, fascinating study. But the problem is they ignored verse 4. You see, if you take one verse out of context, or 2 verses, they looked at verse 2, verse 3, but notice verse 4. These are the moedim of the Lord. Wait a minute, go back to the previous verse 2. These are the moedim of the Lord, word for word. Okay. Holy convocations, and you'll see in verse 2, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times, which is at their Moedim. At their the word Moedim appears 4 times, 3 times as plural, 1 time as singular in those verses. So what is happening here? And the best we understand now, and again, scholars have pointed this out, and I concur with various scholars from various denominations. God starts out talking about these are the Moedim.
It's like a chiasm.
It's like some, you may call it a chiasm, sort of, but it talks about the Moedim, and then he brings in the 7th-day Sabbath as a reminder, and then he said, oh, now let's go and speak about it, okay, the actual feasts, okay, because the word is, notice, it says, these are the feasts, and in the first verse 2, it doesn't say these, the word ele. He starts by the feasts, but we get to the verse, then he throws in parenthetically, it's called parenthetically thrown in the Sabbaths, because the Sabbath also has to do with certain activities there's a holy convocation on Sabbath. There are holy convocations during the rest of the annual things.
It sounds like my wife, sometimes she's talking about something and suddenly she refers to this and then she gets back to this previous subject.
Correct, yes. And you are allowed to interrupt yourself. I call it, a parenthesis here, and multiple scholars recognize that. That's nice. I drew on a lot of serious scholars. Yes. Superficially, it looks like the Sabbath is part. But one of the best-known scholars, Jacob Milgrom, who wrote commentary, Anchor Bible commentary on Leviticus.
So you refer to him?
I refer to him. I quote him extensively. Oh. And he shows information that the Sabbath is not included in this. And how do we know? Because another thing that's fascinating, Milgrom has showed in verse 4. The Hebrew wording of verse 4 is an inclusio, which is a technical term. It's like the bookends. Okay, verse 4 has specific language, and in verse 37 or verse 38,
yes, exactly where it ends.
Where it ends, and it shows that these Moedim are unique, and they are lumped together in a chiastic structure,
separately from the Sabbath of the Lord.
Correct. And so I deal with that extensively because this is an argument that I didn't realize was going to be raised. And by the way, I just opened up. This is a study done by another guy. He did his doctorate on Leviticus 23. His entire dissertation was Leviticus 23. Warning, Warning is his last name. He's a German scholar, and so he did his entire dissertation on this. And I quote his scholarly study. What is his first name? Wilfried Warning, or Wilfried Warning. Yes, literary artistry in Leviticus. Wow. And it's published by Brill, well-recognized scholarly publication, 1999. And he shows it's a complete chiastic structure. Amazing chiasm. And the Sabbath is outside of it. The Sabbath is mentioned before the chiastic structure. The Sabbath is mentioned afterwards. It's not part of the chiasm at all. And then along comes Milgrom, and he shows how there's an inclusio. Verse 4 reads, Mikrae, Kodesh, Asher, Tikru, Otam, and verse 37, Asher, Tikru, Otam, Mikrae, Kodesh. It's the wording is so clear in the Hebrew. He says it is locked in.
It's like a tapestry.
It's like a tapestry. Okay. He says the order of these words is reversed. It's a chiastically related inclusio, showing that the Sabbath is not part of it. When you look at the language, the structure of Leviticus 23, there's no way, if you do your homework, that you can include it. On the surface, it looks like it, but it is clearly excluded. It's an amazing... Oh, one more thing.
Yes.
This is the part of the study. Milgrom mentions it, but I also found that he's right. Isher is a specific fire sacrifice that is for other times, but never specific sacrifice on the Sabbath. You don't have an Isher on the Sabbath. Milgrom pointed out, I did an extensive study on the Isher. There are multiple factors that disassociate the Sabbath from the feasts, the Moedim, to be more accurate. So that's another fascinating study, Leviticus 23. The Sabbath is not, Milgrom says it multiple times, the Sabbath is not a moed. It's not an appointed season.
But, okay, now we need to clarify one thing. You referred to the triad in the previous program.
Yes.
In Colossians 2:16, it mentions holy day, or then the feast,
which is Pilgrim Festival. Let's be
Pilgrim Festival. Yes.
Pilgrim
or
Festival,
new moon,
or new moons,
or the Sabbath, or Sabbath days.
Yes, take the word "the." It's not there. Sabbath,
or Sabbaths.
Yeah, yes. Sabbath or Sabbaths.
So we have 3.
Yeah.
Now, some would refer to this as annual, monthly, and weekly.
Yes, that's been a major argument, and admittedly, I joined that argument for a while because it does look persuasive.
Yes.
And the reason it looks persuasive because there are multiple texts in the Old Testament.
Which follow that progression.
Actually, they don't. If you look carefully,
Really?
no, they don't. And this is what was very disconcerting when I first heard that argument. Then I went and I looked at it.
Yes.
And most of them, it starts in the book of Numbers, which is the original time when God identified the burnt sacrifices for the different sacred occasions. And it starts with a daily sacrifice, the Tamid.
Mhm.
It says burnt offerings on the Tamid, the daily, or in the morning and evening,
Mhm.
or on the Yamim, the days. It starts with sacrifices for the days. Now it starts with days. Then it goes to sacrifices on the Sabbath. And it is the Sabbath, the the 7-day Sabbath. Then it goes to sacrifices on the months. Then it goes to sacrifices on the annual. It goes from daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. And it is correct. And it's Numbers 28 that has that. It's not a
Yes.
triad. It's not a triad.
It's not a triad.
No,
And
it's
that's
actually,
that's a point you make.
correct. It is actually what I call a tetrad. It's a 4-part. See, it's not 3 parts. First thing is it's 4 parts, and it goes, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and in that 4 parts, it is the 7-day Sabbath, clearly identified.
But you say there's no triads.
Those are not the triads in the commonly used ones, and the common ones are in Nehemiah, in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which are all built from what we can see on Numbers.
And those in Ezekiel?
Ezekiel is a more complex, and the reason apparently it's more complex, the scholars recognize, is because the sacrifices were of a different level, not the same sacrifices that were given in the Pentateuch.
Yes.
And so Ezekiel's parts are unique, but in the Ezekiel passages, it's also never 3. It's never 3.
It's more than 3.
It's more than 3. It's also using plural terms, whereas if you go to the actual, we'll get to that later on in detail, but Colossians is all singular words. Singular grammatically, actually, grammatical singular words, the way the words were used, but the scholars call them collective singulars. Like sometimes we say fish, look at the fish, and
Yes.
we mean lots of them. But it's a collective, but they're singular in their form. They're
Yes.
actually singular
But
words.
referring to
Whereas in Ezekiel, those in Ezekiel 45 and 46, those are plurals, different order, and the focus in Ezekiel is a different focus. It's burnt sacrifices. I've got multiple distinctives on the so-called triad. Superficially, it looks like Colossians is quoting from Nehemiah, from 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and from Ezekiel. But
So-
when you look at it, there is
so
the
according to
evidence.
your research, why is this not a triad here in Colossians 2:16?
Well, I'm not saying that Colossians 2 is not a triad. I'm saying that
But-
the Old Testament passages
Yeah.
are all 4 sections. They were the ones in the Old Testament are 4. Colossians 2:16 has 3 parts.
Yeah,
No question. But here they have 4: daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. Okay, and then again Ezekiel 4 parts.
Okay.
See?
Okay. So your reasoning is this triad is not referring to annual, monthly, weekly,
Correct.
because in
Well,
the Old
first,
Testament
yeah.
it's more than 3.
That's the first argument. It's more than 3.
Okay.
Correct. It's different. It's more than 3. It's generally 4 or more. Number 2, the order in which it is placed
Mhm.
is not the way it's in the Old Testament. Most of them. There's one that superficially looks the same. It's the one in Ezekiel 45, but there are many other dissimilarities,
Yes.
like the
Okay.
fruit I mentioned.
Okay.
There are
I'm with
multiple dissimilarities, even though on the surface, one of them looks similar. But none of these actually are an illusion. They don't link up. There is one, however, that clearly is a link, and that is Hosea. The only one that has a 3-part,
you. Yes.
that's Hosea
Okay.
chapter 2. So let's go there, because this is the most fascinating thing. And by the way, scholars link Hosea, they throw it into the mix, even though they admit Hosea's one looks a little different. And Hosea is different. Why is it different? Hosea isn't focusing on talking about sacrifices. It's talking about the days. Hosea has a 3-parter. And so that's multiple evidences that Hosea is unique. And Hosea does not use the word moed in the 3 parts. And the 3 parts are linked linguistically together. But there are 5 to start with, but the 3 are linguistically linked, and various scholars recognize.
Yes, in my translation it says in chapter 2, verse 11, I will
Yes.
also cause her mirth to cease, her
Right.
feast days,
Yes.
her new moons,
Yes.
and the Sabbaths,
Yeah. Those are the three terms. Keep going.
and all the solemn feasts.
Correct. And the first all is the first phrase. Notice all. And the last phrase is all. Okay. And so these three sit together. Well-recognized scholars, I quote, showing that, like Anchor Bible or these well-recognized sources, Friedman and Anderson, they recognize that the two terms are on the outside and these three go together. And also there's a zakef katon and an athnach, Hebrew punctuation, that comes before the word feast and after the word Sabbath, showing that you should pause. So the Masoretes put the three together, feast, new moons, and Sabbaths. The Hebrew punctuation shows that they recognized hundreds of years ago that the three words belong together. So actually the Hebrew punctuation in the Masoretic text puts feast, new moon, Sabbath together.
Which means what?
Which the evidence is quite strong that when people say Paul is quoting Hosea, they are right. The evidence, and I suggest...
So there is a link between these two texts.
Very likely, if Paul is quoting. Okay? And as I mentioned before, in my thesis, I suggest strongly that it is Paul. If Paul is quoting anyway, he is making a direct allusion to Hosea 2.
Which means if those all are connected and these three are combined, that this Sabbath is not a weekly Sabbath.
Well, is it? That's the question.
That's the question.
That's what I had to address. What I found out, I first wanted to find out which passage is Paul or passages is Paul most likely quoting. And I used another scholar, Christopher Beetham, who wrote his entire thesis on what is it called? Literary echoes from the Old Testament in the New. And so he points out, he says you have to go and see what is an allusion. So he has a definition, and then I broaden it so I can include more. I want to be more generous than even Christopher Beetham in his thesis. Sure. So I said, let's look at what is an allusion. I show what an allusion is according to the grammar, and then I say, now let's look if Paul was alluding to. You see, and an allusion is when a New Testament scholar wants you to think back at an Old Testament text, remember the context, know what it's talking about, to draw in a point.
Like the Lord's Day in Revelation 1:10.
Yes, correct. What is it talking about? You have to go to how it was used before. Same type of thing. So I maintain that there is evidence. Those who claim, and there are many who say, Paul is alluding to Hosea 2, verse 11. And I am in full agreement with all those who say Paul is alluding to Hosea 2. But then my question is, so what is Hosea talking about?
Exactly.
Right. When Hosea said, no, I will remove all her rejoicing, her celebrations, misosach, then her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and then he says, even or Afrikaans, ja, al hulle, and then he talks about all of their festival times, and it's all on both sides. What is Hosea talking about? It's the most fascinating study of that brought out a lot new information, because when we look at the word feast, what is Hosea talking about? When he says feast, he uses the word chag, which is limited, agreed. In a setting, a ritual setting, it is only pilgrim festivals. So when Hosea says, I will remove all of her celebrations, this is a general term, her rejoicing, her feasts, that is her Hagim in the plural, but in Hosea it's in the singular. It's her feast, singular, collective singular. I will remove her feast. That's her pilgrimage festival. Revised English Bible, New English Bible, recognize it's not all annual. It's selected annual. So it's those that were kept and they went to Jerusalem. Her new moons, and that is correct in the context. The word Chodesh is there. And then it says her Sabbath. It's also singular, 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 singular. This is interesting because when we get to the New Testament,
it's plural.
In English. It's English. But the grammar is singular. Now you're going to keep this in mind. The grammar in Hosea is all singular. Singular, singular, singular. What's interesting, these other places that people claim that Paul is quoting, plurals, plurals, plurals. When you get to the New Testament, Paul uses singular, singular, singular. So that's a hint, because when you get to Galatians chapter 3, verse 16, Paul quotes, he says it's and to his seed, singular, not to seeds, plural. Paul makes a point just on the singular and plural. So I'm suggesting Paul is a careful Torah scholar. He therefore is quoting Hosea. And all I have to then identify, because I'm agreeing with them, what is Hosea talking about? And this was very helpful. My conclusion, her Sabbath. Again, not the Sabbath, not the Sabbath day. Her is an actual link for ceremonial Sabbath. I've shown that. And I've got even Milgram's scholarship that shows that when it talks about, the Yom Kippur, it's Israel's Sabbath. Not. It's interesting. The linguistic links are fascinating. It's not the Sabbath day. It's her Sabbath.
Wow.
And people say, oh, that's because they rejected God. No, that's not because they rejected God. When they rejected God and they were being castigated in Jeremiah, God called them my Sabbath still. Even though the people had rejected him, it's still my Sabbath. So her doesn't mean it's Israel's because they rejected them. That's an incorrect argument. It's ceremonial. Sabbath's the last word. And why is this interesting? Something I discovered in the writing of my thesis in the last few months. I'm like, wow. Multiple scholars, at least as far back as a well-known scholar by the name of George Bush, 1840s. He pointed out, and he showed it, and multiple scholars I found out, and it's in the text. The context of Hosea is the threat of being taken into captivity. And many scholars believe that they were, of course, that the fulfillment was probably the Assyrian captivity and the 8th century BC. Maybe some say around 720, 722, they were taken to captivity. However, multiple scholars recognize that the Sabbath could be kept anywhere. You didn't have to be near the temple.
Like with a feast.
Like with a feast.
That's a crucial point.
That's right. And so the scholars, they point out in the text of Leviticus 23, you keep the Sabbath in all your dwellings. Wherever you live, you keep the Sabbath. And so if they are removed from Jerusalem, they can still keep the seventh-day Sabbath, but they won't be able to keep some of these other that are more dependent upon the sanctuary. Day of Atonement is sanctuary dependent. And these, therefore, have to be ceremonial Sabbaths, required. Yom Kippur. And so you have annual of the pilgrim festivals, the Chag there, and the word is singular, new moons, and then Sabbath, Shabbat, her Sabbath, Day of Atonement, including the 10 days before would be what we call Yom Teruah, New Year's Day, Rosh Hashanah. Okay, so we have that there, Day of Trumpets. Yes. People call it the Feast of Trumpets. The Bible never calls it feast. It's 10 days to warn you, get ready for the Day of Judgment, or Day of Vindication, depending on where you are in your relationship with God. But so there it is. So contextually, it's impossible to be the seventh-day Sabbath because they could keep the Sabbath everywhere. And they said, the writers, I was amazed. I only discovered it just before I handed my final draft. It was clear. Multiple people said when they went into captivity, the one thing that kept them together was the celebration of the seventh-day Sabbath. Mm-hmm. So Hosea couldn't have said, I'm going to remove your seventh-day Sabbaths when you're taken to captivity, because it doesn't fit the argument. And I'm like, wow. And so it's not in this book. Sorry, you bought the early edition. You're going to get it in my thesis. But so there are many more who are recognizing it cannot be this. They never say it, but all the arguments they give prove that the Sabbath cannot be the one that they will be missing taking. Excellent. It has to be ceremonial Sabbaths, ritual Sabbaths, which were celebrated at the sanctuary.
Excellent. Wow. This is
they're
amazing.
Like, wow. And so that's so Hosea is talking about that.
How do you know that the Sabbath in Colossians 2:16 is not plural?
Okay, we'll get now. That's a major. I had it.
We have 15 minutes
left. We'll do that. One of my own friends wrote a strong negative critique of this book. And because he's a personal friend, he contacted me and said, Ron, I'm critiquing your book and I don't agree with you. And he is a New Testament academic. So he said, I'll send you a copy beforehand. And when it came to this issue, he said to me on the phone, I disagree with you saying that Sabbata, the lexical term, or Sabbaton, the way it appears here, is singular. And he says, you're completely wrong because irrefutably it is plural. And I said, did you not read what I said? I said "laitos," and I quoted a slew of grammarians and scholars of Greek for the last however long. And he still sent in his critique negatively. Ron Dupre and all scholars are wrong. And I thought, wow, either he's arrogant or he knows his stuff. I said, you know what? But he's got a point. I didn't go and check it out for myself. I simply relied on these scholars who said Sabbata is an Aramaic loan word, because when the Jews were in captivity and they began to lose their language in scripture, we know that they spoke Hebrew, Shabbat, And in Hebrew, you have ha-Shabbat, the Sabbath. And then they made it Shabbatah. It came at the end. And Shabbatah, which is Aramaic, when it is transliterated into Greek, you know, your Greek has no SH. So
Exactly.
it becomes Sabbatah. And that was the word, not the concept, but the word became Sabbatah. However, as the Greek scholars know, Sabbatah is the normal plural. So here's the problem. Shabbatah, which is from Aramaic, is then transliterated into Greek and becomes Sabbatah. So are they using the Aramaic transliteration as a singular, or are they using the pure Greek plural? And my friend, who is an academic not linguist, he's a grammarian. That's the difference. He's a grammarian. He was going with strict grammar. And I went back and studied from 2250, from Xenon all the way through. Every time I could find this word was used in from papyri way back there, through the Septuagint, every use of it, through Xenon, Plutarch, you name it, Latin, Josephus, all the way through deuterocanonical works, you name it, all the way New Testament and the modern Greek Bible. Guess what? 2,250 years of use, the way it's been used. Sabbatah, like the word sheep, you don't know. If I say, look at the sheep, you must assume it's one, unless I say, look at the 5 sheep. And Sabbatah visually looks like a plural, but was used throughout history as a singular.
What?
Unless the grammar forced you to see it as a plural. Okay? We enjoyed over the last year keeping Sabbatah. Obviously, it's plural. Over the last year, we enjoyed keeping.
But this week coming,
and it'll use the word
singular.
Sabbat, it's singular. Or Paul, Acts 17, verse 3, had Sabbatatria.
Yes.
Then we know it's 3 Sabbaths. So I had to disprove my friend who's a grammarian, and I have a little footnote that says, we shouldn't be grammarians, because in the United States and even in South Africa, when we are not speaking pure English, they'll say, it's me.
Just for the record, Jesus is my Sabbath. That's why I'm up so late. I don't even sleep anymore, let alone take a day off every week or afford my employees a day off. I don't even give them breaks. In fact, if they even blink, I chastise them for Jesus not being their rest. How dare you stop working? No, Jesus is our rest. I don't even use the restroom, in fact, because Jesus is my rest. And that horrible thing where they had to take a day off and give animals rest and give people a day off to spend with God. Now that Jesus is the rest, you can just go on working all 7 days of the week because Jesus is my rest. So, cracks whip, get back to work. Jesus is your rest, slave.
Now, that's not correct grammar. The British is, it is I, nominative singular. But there's even a Negro spiritual. It's me, oh Lord. And nobody complains, nobody argues. So when you study scripture, you shouldn't just be a pure grammarian. You have to be a linguist. And unfortunately, my friend was a grammarian, not a linguist. So I ended up with a 60-page paper that got published in a Festschrift. And now I have disproven, and it is singular, even though visually it looks like a plural, but it's what you call collective singular.
Hey, are you sitting down right now? Get up. Get back to work. Are you resting right now? How dare you? Jesus is your rest. Now get back to work. I caught you slacking.
Collective. It's all. So Paul uses singular feast, singular new moon, singular Sabbath, and it is a direct link. And major scholars like Edward Schweitzer and other scholars say Paul is quoting directly from Hosea. I got several scholars who show that. Now, they still believe it's a 7-day Sabbath because their focus wasn't to dig in to find the answers, but this is a direct. Paul is quoting. Paul is alluding to multiple scholars, but they never really study the text in Hosea. Then I add, but even if Paul isn't quoting Hosea, let's argue that Paul is just using the phrase, it's not a quotation. Then I use more arguments to show that, as I mentioned at the beginning, the word eorte is used 27 times, which is pilgrimage festival, irrefutably, and multiple scholars say it's not just annual. It's all of the pilgrim festivals. New moon is, nobody argues about it, and the Sabbath then has to be ceremonial Sabbath. Day of Atonement is called Sabbata in the Septuagint. And interestingly, Day of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, is called Shabbaton or Sabbaton.
If you fall asleep tonight, I'm going to doubt your salvation in Jesus, who is your rest. If you fall asleep tonight, the last thing you'll ever see when you open your eyes from your not resting in Jesus when you're sleeping tonight, just remember the next moment you open your eyes, you're going to see me standing over you with a pillow that says, Jesus is your rest now. And I'm going to lower that pillow over your face. That's the last thing you're going to see. Now get back to work.
It's a similar term. It's a mini Sabbath. You could cook on that day, but other work you couldn't do. Yes. And by extension, it's very likely including sabbatical years. So what it ends up is what they call a chiastic structure. Yes. You've got the annual pilgrimage festivals, Heorte. You've got right here new moon as the pivotal crux, and then you've got annual and by extension the every 7 years Sabbata. You've got 3 here and 3 here. We've got the 3, which is Passover, unleavened bread, number 1, Pentecost, and you've got tabernacles, new moons, and then you've got here trumpet, atonement, and by extension sabbatical years. And in the middle are new moons. And they say, why is new moon so important? That wasn't an important day. Of course, they had no watches. Yes. We got to think back in their time. Without the new moon, they would not know when those days were to be celebrated. It is pivotal. It's the crux.
It hangs on it.
It hangs on it. No new moon. When do we keep it? You know, new moon was the timepiece for all of these. So new moon is that. And so I did a lot on chiastic structures. And so from the chiastic structure, it's annual, monthly, annual, augmented by extension. And that's, I show a lot of the linguistics of scripture, the chiastic, the poetry. It's a fascinating study, but it's very clear. Even without Hosea, it's annual, monthly, annual. And Heorte is never used in the New Testament for atonement, trumpets, or sabbatical years. Paul, if he had to include those. He couldn't leave those out. And what the essence of it is Paul is saying to the new Colossian Christians. These things were all shadows that pointed forward to the substance, which is Jesus Christ. And people say, but it says shadows of things to come. But multiple scholars correctly say Paul is like quoting from the Old Testament when they said, when it was set up, these were shadows of things to come. And the term things to come is a technical term of the coming of the kingdom in the Messiah. Yeah, by the way, Jesus used basically the same term. He said, John the Baptist is Elijah who is to come. And it's in the English Bibles. And by that time, John the Baptist was dead or he was in prison. He had already done his ministry, and Jesus used the same wording, who is to come, even though John had already come. Matthew 11 is very clear. So the term to come is not in the future from the time when Paul wrote it. It's a technical term, as scholars recognize. I think Peter Detterding was one, recognizing these are things to come from the perspective of the Old Testament, pointing forward to the Messiah, Jesus. And they culminated in him. The sacrifices, these all things. That's why as Christians, we don't keep the feast days. That doesn't mean we don't study them. That doesn't mean we can't mark them. We can mark them and learn from them. But because for us as Christians, we believe the Messiah has come, these things pointed to Jesus.
Dr. De Prieur, we really appreciate your time being here. There's so much more that we can add to the study, but time is so limited.
I said to you, I need 10 hours, not one more.
Just a question, where can viewers at home, purchase this information, get their hands on this information? How do we get your thesis? For those of us that are more scholarly intended, or maybe for much of us that are just Bible students, how do we get the book?
Well, this one is available Amazon online.
Oh, really?
You can get this easily online. Judging the Sabbath. Now, it was published 10 years ago, and since then I've added the 2 chapters I've talked about. Leviticus 23 is the Sabbath a feast day, and I'm saying it's not, and that's in the thesis. And then also the other one about singular plural, and Sabbata, it's actually a singular, collective singular. So that's the 2 chapters that are not in here. But you can get the just and essentially I'd say 99% hasn't changed. There's only one text, not pivotal, but I found out more information. It's one of those questionable ones, and I found out more information that unimportant, but I had to change on one text when I was saying it's ceremonial. I found out it is 7th day in Isaiah, I think it was. But It's almost identical to what I've studied.
Mm.
So you can go on and get the book.
Mm.
My thesis, unfortunately, it's in Hebrew, Greek, Dutch, German, English, Latin, and I think one other. But anyway, you know, it's 7 languages, and most of it's untranslated. Some I've transliterated or translated it. So unless you know your languages, you're not going to understand important things, and especially the charts. It's untranslated, much of it. So that's the first problem. So I'm hoping to publish it as soon as possible as a scholarly publication. Then I'm planning to add translation in the text or in footnotes where necessary, and publish it maybe through, I'm going to ask one of the well-respected publishers who publish for the educated laity, and many out there, Erdmann, Zondervan, and so forth. I'm going to see if they will be willing to publish it with the translation so everybody can read it. And then I want to publish a little book for sharing, 50 to 100 pages on just the key issues, and simplified for the really.
What is he talking about? Don't Adventist scholars just like plagiarize Ellen White? I don't think she could speak Latin. I don't know, but maybe not. Maybe I was just confused. I don't know. Oh, anyway, just remember, if you fall asleep tonight, forget that Jesus is your rest. Remember, I'm watching. If those eyes close, the next time they open them, there I'll be with an embroidered pillow with the words, Jesus is your rest now, as I slowly lower it over your face. Send you home early. Just kidding. God bless.